Hello. So for this week, we're talking about externalities and market failure. Now, to give you an example of this, say your local government sent a letter to you and your household, and it's asking you to determine if you want to pay $20 or $100 to fund the local fire department. But there's a catch, right? If more than 50% of the citizens choose only the $20, there won't be enough money for the fire department. What do? This is what we call a free rider problem. Right? Free riders are people who benefit without paying. They're not necessarily evil. Let's face it, you probably know someone that's downloaded Game of Thrones. Right? But they're responding to incentives. Why pay more if I can get it for less or even free? Right? If too many people think like this, then we're all worse off, and we're going to end up not getting the things we want, like fire protection or an ending to Game of Thrones. So how do we get around this idea of the free rider, right? That people will benefit even if they don't pay. Well, the city doesn't usually ask for money. They demand it in the form of taxes, right? The reasoning being that fire protection is so essential that everyone has to have it. No one can opt out. So things that are for collective benefit or well-being, like fire protection and national defense, are often funded by the government. Right? When markets alone fail to provide enough of these things or enough of an incentive to suppliers to produce these things, that's called market failure. Right? And oftentimes, these are what we consider to be public goods. Right? The definition of public good is something that is non-exclusive and non-rivalry. Non-exclusion is the idea that you can't exclude people that don't pay for it. Right? You can't exclude people from the national defense, right? Just because they don't pay for it doesn't mean they don't get the protection of it. And then non-rivalry is the idea that one person's consumption of the good doesn't ruin it for other people. Say a radio station, right? Just because I'm listening to a radio station doesn't mean you can't listen to a radio station. But because I'm eating this apple, you can't eat this apple, right? So if a good or service meets these two criteria, it's highly unlikely that any private firm will produce it because there's no incentive to do so. There's no financial gain, right? And no matter how essential it is, this is the case. Streetlights and organizations that track diseases, right? They're pretty important. And if the government didn't do these things, we probably wouldn't get them. The incentive to do what's best for you rather than what's best for everybody else is the root cause of something we economists call the tragedy of commons. This is the idea that common goods that everybody has access to are often misused and exploited. It often explains our environmental problems like air pollution, deforestation, the killing of endangered species, and even overfishing. If we look in the world today, right, we find many instances, of overfishing. Right? But it's not just bad for the fish, it's bad for the fishermen. If they overfish, then the fishermen are putting themselves out of a job. So why aren't they conserving? Well, if you look at the incentives, if a few environmentally conscious fishermen decide to give the fish time to spawn, then some fishermen will decide not to, right? They'll decide to harvest them instead. If you can't prevent other people from exploiting the resource, then you have an incentive to exploit it yourself and take as much as you want, and as quickly as you can. But with everyone following that logic, the finite resource gets completely wasted. The tragedy of economy explains why fish stocks get depleted, rainforests get cut, and endangered species get hunted. There's an entire field of economics called environmental economics, which focuses on these issues and how to solve them. Now, back to what we're talking about in this chapter, right, is the idea that unregulated markets sometimes don't produce the outcomes that society wants. Also, markets misallocate resources because they don't have the right price signals. So when we go back to the idea of the invisible hand, we look at our supply and demand curves. Right? And at some point is the equilibrium where it maximizes the consumer surplus and maximizes the producer surplus to a quantity where it's maximizing, right? It's maximizing satisfaction. And economics will work towards that equilibrium as if an invisible hand is guiding it. Now, there's also the concept of the invisible boot, right? A boot comes along and just kicks the equilibrium point in some direction. It's an external force working on this equilibrium point, and that's all an externality is. Right? Externalities can be good or positive or bad or negative. If we look at a factory that pollutes, right? The pollution is definitely a negative externality. It's contaminating the waterways, right? Killing fish, possibly making people sick. These external costs are then paid for by the people downstream. Now, in a true free market, we assume that all the costs associated with producing whatever the factory produces is accounted for within the price. But in this case, all the things going on downstream are not included in the price. So, we end up with a market failure. The factory is overproducing, making people sick, and then they're not paying for it. Now, one thing we can do, though, is have government come in to try and solve this problem. Right? The government could tax the factory, or they could say that governments can tax cigarettes, right? They can fund education. They can subsidize fuel-efficient cars or regulate financial markets. They do this because they assume that the free market is not adjusting for these externalities as well as or quickly as it needs to. Now, as we talk about these externalities, we can also talk about the solution for them. The government tries to fix externalities. They use regulatory policies or market-based policies. Regulatory policies are simply rules established by the government, right? They're saying, don't do this, don't do that, don't drive too fast. Right? It seems like the government should regulate some stuff, but how much and how intricate they should get is a question of political debate. Now, the U.S. government has the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, which works to regulate what can be dumped and reduce pollution and regulate production of goods. So, regulation can also create positive externalities. Education. Most countries have compulsory education, right, which requires citizens to be educated up to a specific age, and the government pays for these schools through taxes. If the government didn't get involved, all education would be provided through private schools that would charge tuition, and there might not be enough affordable schools to educate young people. The government funds education because they think the external benefits, like literate, well-informed people, are so high, it's worth forcing everyone to pay for this good. Other nations take this beyond primary to secondary schools and colleges. Now, another way governments try to solve these externalities is through market-based policies. Now, these are policies designed to manipulate markets and prices and create incentives to correct for market failures. These are, in general, taxes and subsidies. Right? A tax on the production of something increases the cost of that. It's affecting the supply. Subsidies decrease the cost of something, which is affecting the demand. Now, in the case of the factory, right, the government could tax the production of whatever the factory is producing or on the chemicals the factory is using, and it will decrease the production and limit pollution. Right? So, now this market-based approach has one key advantage over the regulatory approach. Right? Instead of spending money on enforcing regulations, this government is earning tax revenue, right, that can be used for other purposes. In real life, even though governments use both policies, right, some are far more effective than others. We've actually used this market base previously to look at air pollution, specifically sulfur dioxide pollution, which was causing acid rain. And it worked, right? It significantly reduced the amount of sulfur dioxide produced by U.S. companies. Another thing we've also done is we've done cap and trade, where everyone's allowed a certain amount of carbon or whatever it is, and if you don't meet your limit, you can sell it, or if you're overproducing, you can buy somebody else's limit so you don't have to get fined. Now, taking this whole green environmental question from what we first asked you at the beginning of this video, right? What if the world's largest economies were given a similar proposition as to what I gave you? Select whether you want to decrease your pollution by 5 or 30%. with a small catch. If more than 50% of countries choose only 5%, then climate change will make Earth unlivable. That simplifies the issue, right? But it does illustrate why it's so hard to address climate change. Individual countries might work to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, but they can't prevent other countries from polluting. It's the tragedy of commons all over.